So welcome to the National Security Conversation, Dr. Toby Dalton.
Great to see you.
Toby, let me begin by asking you something that I found very interesting in the Indo-Pacific Strategy document of the United States, which was released last month. It states that the objective is not to change the People's Republic of China, but to shape the strategic environment in which it operates. This is a very interesting statement. What does it entail in your opinion? And how is it different from the earlier approach taken by the United States towards PRC?
So I think what we're seeing in the strategy document is a reflection and articulation of what has been a broad orientation in US policy for some time and is now something of a foreign policy consensus here, which is that the holistic approach to contain Chinese ambition to recenter the international order, both in Asia and globally around Beijing, is something that needs new impetus. This isn't a new idea, obviously. You look back from President George H.W. Bush in the early 1990s and onward, the effort was to try to enmesh China in post-Cold War institutions as a way to try to influence China's trajectory of emergence as a major power. Obviously, some people hoped also that would liberalize China's economy and politics. But there was less consistent effort and commitment, I think, by US administrations to that course and that outcome with China. And so then continuing through different administrations in the George W. Bush administration, you have this new partnership with India to help it emerge as a more significant counterweight to China in the region. You have in the Obama administration, the so-called pivot to Asia, which is really a recognition about what level of effort would be required by the US to, quote, shape the strategic environment. The evolution under Trump then with the free and open Indo-Pacific and the Quad. And so the Biden strategy, I think, really, as it's reflected in this document, is continuity of this 3 decades long trend. Fleshes out some ideas, tries to keep the framing flexible and attuned to the interests and sensitivities of various partners. For example, the language in there about promoting prosperity and resilience, it's not just security-oriented aims. This is really intended to be more holistic than that. As a former bureaucrat myself, though, I can also recognize that as a strategy document, this becomes something of a Christmas tree, is the expression that we like to use, where when you have a structure like this, lots of different bureaucratic interests want to hang their initiative on the tree. And so these documents can become kind of bloated. And so you do see a lot of things in here, wishes, bureaucratic priorities, and so forth, that have kind of been thrown at this thing and stuck to it, that may or may not hang together and actually deliver on the full vision.
Right. If I push you a little further on that, what, in your opinion, are some of the attributes or characteristics of this objective of shaping the strategic environment in which China operates?
I think there are a number of different attributes, and partly it's tone. We have to recognize the significant change in tone and language that the US officials are using, are seeking to then instill in alliance documents and language with partners and so forth. So I think there's been an effort across the board to kind of reshape the narrative around what China is doing. This is actually consistent with what Chinese officials are also doing to reshape their narrative in diplomacy. So I'd say that's one attribute of it. More concretely than that, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more, the US has long had this hub and spokes model of alliances and partnerships in Asia. And I think there's something of a transformation going on. And the broader effort is not just to make sure that the spokes individually are strong, but that there's greater connectivity between all of the partners, and there's kind of a thickening, if you will, of initiatives and so forth to make sure that over time the sum is greater than the parts. I think that's really what this document is aimed at, and that's where the U.S. strategy is headed with all of the initiatives that are described. Obviously, the challenge here is that this is not a static problem. And so the understanding of the threat perceived from China, whether it's in Washington or in New Delhi or in Seoul or in Canberra, that's changing constantly. And so I think part of the challenge here for the US and others is to continue to adapt and be flexible. And so this document suggests a fair amount of flexibility as well. So flexibility as an attribute, I think, is another hallmark here.
Right, Toby. The United States supports, according to the document, India as a partner in its Indo-Pacific vision and its role as a net security provider. How do you characterize the two countries' approach to the Indo-Pacific? We often hear in Delhi that there are competing visions. It's not as if we have the same vision for the Indo-Pacific, the United States and India. To what extent, in your opinion, are these converging visions, and are there what in your opinion are some of the divergences in these two sort of visions?
Yeah, it's been interesting to observe this over time, and I'm not a linguist, but there are definitely important differences in language that have been used in both capitals, and not just sort of the words that are spoken, but body language too, if you will, between US and Indian leaders. So clearly there are overlaps in how they view the region, but also important differences owing to obvious geographic, economic, other ideational factors, how they see the challenge of in India's case, living next to China, and in the US case, being present in the region in ways that are additive and don't provoke Chinese reactions. So I think when the US began to float the Indo-Pacific and Quad terminology during the Trump administration, at a time when there was starting to be growing talk in Washington about a new Cold War type framework, clearly there was discomfort in New Delhi with the idea of any kind of grouping that would seem kind of statutorily against China. And so my observation was that the language that was used by Indian leaders at that time was to stress that the Quad wasn't really a security or a military entity. It wasn't directed against China, et cetera. And that's where the rub was, is how to talk about these partnerships without talking about China. It's like the really popular new song right now. We don't talk about Bruno, or we don't talk about China in the Quad, or something like that, right? And so I think, here what we're seeing in the Biden approach, this broader framework, it may better comport with India's vision for how to be a security provider, because India is changing too. I mean, I think after Doklam, after Galwan Valley, et cetera, you see a sharp shift in kind of the outlook from Delhi on how to manage relations with China. So actually, there may actually be more kind of increasing convergence now in how to talk about the Indo-Pacific as a region, as kind of the roles of partners in providing security, if not in military posture. What I found really interesting, actually, in looking at the Indo-Pacific Strategy document released by the Biden administration, though, is that the Quad language in there is completely free of any security-related jargon. If you look at the list of action items at the end, pandemic response, emerging technology, climate, STEM education, there was nothing in there about security at all. So clearly there's still kind of some fundamental ideas that have to be resolved. I guess going back to your earlier question too about kind of the attributes of the US approach, the need to transition this hub and spoke system, you see also coming up into the security alliances with Japan, South Korea, Australia, and trying to make it more cohesive. And India is implicated in this by virtue of the Quad, even if it isn't a formal alliance partner. And so I guess one question that I would have, and this is probably more a question for you, if South Korea were to join the Quad and it effectively becomes a quint, then India starts to look a little bit like the odd duck in that grouping. And so what implications would that have, both for the grouping and for India? That's interesting. Depending on how the South Korean election goes in a couple of weeks, that's perhaps a near-term question that should be discussed.
In any case, I think generally there is a growing conversation about Quad Plus. New Delhi probably hasn't warmed up to the idea that much, but I think this is something that we are going to hear a lot of in the days to come. But let me sort of take you away from that question to me, and then ask you something else, which is you sort of have heard about this new policy that India has put in place called Act Far East. India is also currently developing or preparing to launch what it calls the Vladivostok Chennai maritime route, focusing on China. India is also keen on getting the Russians to sort of collaborate more with it in the maritime sphere. I know this is the wrong time to talk about getting Russians to collaborate, etc. But be that as it may, given the fact that India has been quite positive about warming up to the Russians, even in the maritime sphere, how do you think the US and its allies probably would go on to view this sort of a Russia connection that India has, which is one of the Quad partners?
Yeah. It's really, had we had this conversation 3 weeks ago, maybe it would have been a little bit easier to
I know.
Imagine that. But with events as they are, given Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's a little hard to say. Let me offer a couple of thoughts, I guess, on the idea of increasing India's maritime connectivity in the region and kind of better efforts to secure trade routes and energy supplies and so forth. I think that there is great sympathy for that, and that comports very clearly with a lot of the vision that you see in this strategy document. And as in terms of expanding India's role as a security provider in the region, this seems like a net good. The challenge really is in the second part of that, is kind of what's Russia's role. And again, if Russia is going to continue to be under very significant sanctions for the near future or even the midterm future because of these actions, then which I would say seem to have significant support now also in Tokyo and Seoul and perhaps other places along those routes, then that raises really interesting questions about how India might try to engage Russia. I think people here could understand the logic, but if you look at recent events, and I'm not just talking about the Ukraine invasion, but even going back a few weeks before that, you have the Xi-Putin statement on the Sino-Russian partnership at the start of the Olympics. Mm-hmm. That puts Russia now kind of in a different potentially position relative to India and China than it was before. So I guess is this really where India wants to hitch its wagon? I think the idea of hedging and fence sitting will be understood to an extent. There are historical ties, particularly in defense industry and so forth, between India and Russia. But new initiatives or new effort, I think, would be viewed pretty skeptically here, at least until a time when Russia's orientation vis-a-vis Ukraine and elsewhere has changed.
I know this is a counterfactual question, but let's sort of try and take the Russian invasion of Ukraine out of the equation and see, had that not happened, how the West have responded to the Indian initiative of connecting with Russia through the maritime route.
It's an interesting counterfactual because I feel like there's been a level of understanding, again, on the defense sales side in particular. So, okay, S-400, we don't like it, but probably we'd prefer to not let that disrupt what we're attempting to build with India. And so can kind of look the other way. I feel also like economic activity has been less problematic in terms of how the US has viewed the region. And so if India were to articulate a a vision for this maritime route as kind of a counterpoint, if you will, to BRI or something like that.
Exactly.
In which Russia would participate, and it kind of creates more trade flow and interdependence within the region without increasing dependence and potential leverage for China. I think people here could probably get behind that. That's my sense of it, at least.
Right, Toby. Let's get back to the document. The document claims that bolstering Indo-Pacific security is one of the key 5 objectives of the United States in the region. How well you think the US has been going about meeting this particular objective of bolstering security in the Indo-Pacific region?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, this is not a linear problem, and it's always going to move in fits and spurts based on what allies want and partners' interests, how effective diplomacy is, other priorities, or in this case, distractions, if we're talking about Russia and Ukraine, a tragic distraction. And it's also clear that adversaries, whether it's China or North Korea or others, get a vote in how this proceeds too. What's interesting here actually is that if you look at what's happening now in Europe, I mean, Russia has effectively within 3 days undone 4 decades of post-Cold War policy in Europe, 3 decades, where essentially there was sort of policy complacency around the confrontation. And so in that regard, I think a key motivator or even driving factor in the potential success of US efforts to increase security has been the growing awareness and even consensus among partners of the need to do more together collectively to try to contain Chinese visions of returning some traditional hegemonic role in the region. And so I think that's, to the extent that this strategy will be successful, a lot of that is going to hinge on Chinese behavior. In any case, over the last 2 decades, I think we see clear investments in upgrading the US-Japan and US-ROK alliances to meet new security challenges, and trying, at least in the South Korean case, to start to reorient that alliance a little bit more towards China. You have this AUKUS initiative now with Australia. So if you were to actually go back and look at, let's say, President Clinton's visit to India in 2000 as a benchmark, how has the US-India relationship changed since then? It's remarkable, right? On the security front, significant changes. I'm not as expert in following what happens in Southeast Asia, but my sense is that US engagement with Vietnam and Philippines, in particular, over the last several years has also increased. So I think, given the changing perceptions of the China threat, given these investments over time, I think that the metric of seeing this sweep of the last several decades suggests that the US is doing okay. Obviously, there have been some tangents, some periods of poor or even inept policy making and execution, but steady overall progress compared to the baseline. The other metric, though, that would be interesting to get into is the region more secure today? And there I'd have to say, arguably not. And that may have more to do with perceived threats and associated dangers of conflict. And so now we're kind of in this interplay of the spiral. In international relations, we talk a lot about the spiral model and arms racing and security dilemmas. So are we in the midst of this now, where efforts by the US and partners to strengthen security then spur Chinese reactions or Russian reactions or what have you, that then actually diminish the total effect that was sought with the initial activities? I fear that we're kind of headed in that direction now. And so even though the objective here is to improve security, some of the actions, particularly in the security sphere, may drive counter reactions that then attenuate the effects that we're trying to achieve.
Right. The document also talks about, and I quote here, the US will work in flexible groupings that pool our collective strength to face up to the defining issues of our time, particularly through the Quad. Now, the question is, does the Quad in its sort of present shape and form have the ability to deliver? If not, what needs to be done? I mean, you did discuss about Quad earlier on, but I just want to sort of try and understand the sort of thinking that exists in Washington, D.C. about the ability of the Quad or the lack thereof to deliver.
Yeah, I guess my sense is that it's still a very nascent effort. It's taking individual relationships and trying to make them into something greater. And so the idea of pooling collective strength is just, it's too amorphous. You need more than pooling in order to actually achieve the results. Some things, military exercises like Malabar can help. But if you want something that's greater than the sum of the parts, you have to actually translate that, at least in the security side, into things like joint operational plans and concepts. And the Quad is way short of that, I think, by design. Going back to our earlier point, a lot of the language in this document about the Quad is everything but security orientation. So you end up with kind of a patchwork of things. And the problem with patchworks is that the patches themselves may be integral, but it's at the seams where you have problems. And so can the seams actually be stitched together in a way that creates some sort of pooled strength that allows this grouping of countries to really face up to the key challenges? How to make the Quad more integrated is I think the big issue here. Well, clearly that is something that China is working hard to prevent. And so that interplay strikes me as really difficult to predict. And again, some of the integration may be driven less by common interest and more by common fear or common reaction to steps that China might take. And again, that's hard to predict. So in thinking about what should be done, I don't take issue with any of the items in the 3 pages of the action list that come at the end of this Indo-Pacific strategy document. Lots of good initiatives in there, some of them more concrete than others. And I'm sure that there is a similar list in New Delhi and in other capitals too. But the problem I see is how to reconcile the elements of those visions, how to pace them, how to move forward together so that it could deliver on this vision of sort of pooled collective strength with the necessary flexibility.
Right, Toby, is it your belief that the resistance to Quad, having a security orientation or China being mentioned in that, is that resistance coming from India? Is that your belief?
I think the reticence is probably, my perception is that a reticence is more from India than it is from the other partners. But you also have a significant change in tone from the Trump to the Biden administration too. And so I think this is a fairly fluid situation, and the strategy document tries to paper over that fluidity with lots of different approaches, basically. So you have lots of different visions and vision statement, descriptive language, etc., which is fine. And I think if we're going to maintain flexibility, then it has to follow from that partners be sensitive to how others perceive, talk about the threats from China. You tell me, but I would guess that if you were to do a public opinion survey in India today, you'd have a lot more agreement about the threat posed by China than you would have
Absolutely.
2-3 years ago.
Absolutely.
Just to give you a point of comparison, I did a public opinion poll with some colleagues on South Korea recently. And if you ask South Koreans which state is going to pose the greatest threat to their security in the next 10 years, over half, 55%, said China. And so this is starting to change. I think the coalescing of public opinion that will start to feed back into politics. And as domestic politics reorients around this perceived threat, then you may see more commonality of language and approach.
Right. Toby, let's try and sort of understand the whole Indo-Pacific strategy in the context of what's happening now. So how, in your opinion, is the crisis in European geopolitics today will sort of impact the US Indo-Pacific strategy, if at all?
I feel like we need the crystal ball for this one. It's hard to say, and I think it depends a lot on the end game with Ukraine, with Russia, with NATO. It could have really significant and long-lasting spillover effects in several regions, not just in the Indo-Pacific, but also in the Middle East and of course, Europe. I think you see now in the sanctions first approach that's been carried by the Biden administration, the U.S. is clearly not intending to directly confront Russia or send troops into Ukraine. Europe seems more likely to continue generating the funds and equipment to support Ukraine directly. And you've seen remarkable changes in, Finland and Sweden and Switzerland, countries that until now had been much more sort of tempered in their responses to what Russia has done. So also interesting, it's happened at the same time that the Biden administration sent this high-level delegation of former senior officials to Taiwan. Clearly, I think signaling, even if they didn't use this language, but clearly signaling, don't get any ideas and don't think that we're too distracted by what's happening in Europe and we're not paying attention in Asia. And so I guess for me, the longer term question about this moment in European geopolitics is what that does to the durability of US attention to the Indo-Pacific region. There's going to continue to be events, crises, et cetera. Maybe it's Iran again, or there's more sort of resurgence of the counterterrorism mission. So it's very hard, I think, in terms of foreign policy for the US to maintain consistent focus and effort and trying to implement the Indo-Pacific strategy. Doesn't mean it can't happen. I see it as very hard. Domestic politics is also becoming really increasingly important in this too. And even if you look at the continuity that I painted across administrations in my earlier remarks, well, underlying that was this question mark in the Trump administration about whether the US was really committed to some of those core concepts. Mm-hmm. There's some news that came out very recently that Trump said that had he been elected to a second term, he was going to pull out of some alliances. So if alliances are at the core of the strategy and you say you're going to pull out of alliances, what does that say about the strategy? So if we have another election in the US in which we return to the White House, somebody with Trump's proclivities, I guess,
or himself.
Or himself, which is also a possibility we shouldn't rule out. What does that do to this strategy? And so I think we have to consider that domestic politics may be a significant driver or mitigator of the effectiveness and again, that durability of attention from the US to the region.
You mentioned Taiwan. I mean, the reality is that the United States and NATO allies failed to deter Russia in Ukraine. So do you think the United States will probably now have to rethink its Taiwan strategy? Or do you think the current strategy will deter China from doing what it might be planning to do?
Yeah. Well, first point, Ukraine is not Taiwan and Russia is not China. And we need to be really clear on the limits of the analogy and the implications for what can or can't be deterred in what I think are really very different circumstances. It's also useful to consider how states will interpret or learn lessons from this experience in Ukraine. And that's just not going to be known for quite some time yet. So yes, we failed to deter an invasion. Could it have been deterred? If so, by what? Or might some of the steps intended to deter actually have hastened or created escalation pathways involving NATO that didn't occur because of the less direct approach? I think we need to look at both sides of that equation and consider those possibilities. I'm not a Taiwan expert by any stretch, but my impressions are that China is hoping not to do what Russia has done in Ukraine, and in fact, to avoid a situation where it feels compelled to invade, rather to accrete power to the point that US and Taiwan effectively have to capitulate without any conflict, that they'll just recognize that Beijing has the ability to control Taiwan, and the costs of trying to contest that are too high. For the US part, the strategy has been to try to not corner Beijing into a position where it would feel compelled to invade, while also strengthening Taiwan's ability to defend itself and signaling that the US is invested in this status quo. So the question is, how long can the US sustain this policy, and whether China is also, how long China will be okay with the status quo. Any shift by the US to become more directly engaged could well provoke an action that neither side really wants. And so that's actually thinking ahead to the Ukraine lessons. The US approach may not have deterred the invasion, but more direct US engagement or NATO engagement in Ukraine might have actually hastened the invasion and made it more dangerous, given then a direct clash between Russia and NATO troops. So I think it's too soon to say, I guess, is my bottom line about Taiwan. But clearly it's something that people in Washington are concerned about, that Beijing not get funny ideas based on what it's observing in Ukraine, that from the US standpoint, the status quo is something that we're heavily invested in.
Right. Here's my final question. Again, in the wake of what's happening in Ukraine today, do you think as you said, the states might draw different lessons from what's happening? The crisis in Ukraine, will states in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, draw certain lessons from that? And I have South Korea and Japan in mind. And would that lead to some sort of nuclear proliferation in the region, and how would that complicate the United States regional strategy, as it were?
My sense is that lessons from Ukraine are unlikely to be significant drivers of potential proliferation in South Korea and Japan as a way to try to mitigate the potential for Chinese aggression and its near abroad. The more likely drivers of proliferation, I think, are more related, traditionally have been understood more about the US willingness to follow through on defense commitments. But these are really complex decisions. And again, going back to the domestic politics, I think is becoming a bigger factor. And the polling that I mentioned on South Korea, so we asked South Koreans whether they would like to have nuclear weapons, and if so, for what reasons. And what we found actually is that in that case, there's interest in having nuclear weapons as a way to decrease dependence on the US, even though they want to retain the alliance structure. So you have this highly securitized environment. Support for nuclear weapons is actually positively associated with the belief that the US follows through on defense commitments. So it's not some fear of US retrenchment that is actually driving proliferation interests there. And so that's why I think it's not tightly coupled to the Ukraine example. Japan and maybe even Taiwan, we could say, are quite different cases in terms of proliferation threats. So the US strategy for now, I think, is to encourage allies to remain non-nuclear. But I have, and this is something that I think about and have done a little bit of work on, I'm quite interested in the question of what would happen if an ally did decide to proliferate? Would the US sanction an ally at a time when we're trying to keep together this alliance? We've been through this, obviously, with the S-400 and the CAATSA sanctions. Nuclear proliferation is arguably a higher order case than that. But in any case, the calculus is effectively the same, which is, would we decide that it's better to have a nuclear ally than an estranged former ally with nuclear weapons in a region in which we have strong interests? And I don't know how US officials would analyze that. But to the extent that Chinese threats are a plausible driver of nuclearization, we should hope that Beijing thinks about that possibility, especially if they continue to expect that the US will restrain allies from proliferating. So I think that's how I think about the kind of spillover, is that it's, again, still too early to say, but it doesn't quite connect to the likely drivers of proliferation, at least in terms of perceptions of US defense commitment.
Toby, thank you so much for your very insightful comments. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Happymon. Good to see you as well.
Thank you, Toby. We'll put it out as soon as possible, and as we do so, I will send you a link. And thank you so much for thank you so much.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. I hope that was okay. This was good homework for me.
I mean, this is very reflective and thoughtful and insightful. Not the usual, let's sort of jump the gun kind of stuff. No, this is what we needed. Very sober.
I'm not a polemicist, so
there you go. Thank you. You have a wonderful day, Toby.
Thanks. You too. Good to see you, everyone.
Bye-bye.